This training is to review the reading aloud and scribing accommodations for the online WIDA access for ELL's assessment. About this training, Washington contracts with the WIDA Consortium for multiple assessments with different rules. This includes the screener and the access test. This training covers only of the accommodations for online access for ELLs and WIDA Screener Online. Teachers administering with any other assessment should consult the WIDA Accessibility and Accommodations Manual for information and contact Kiana Hennigan at Assessment at 4057 with any questions. Students perform best when they know and are familiar with not just how to do their supports, but also with the person providing them. If you don't know your student, meet ahead of time to do a nice activity like a puzzle or a game. Then go through what you will be doing together and how reading or scribing will work. Afterwards, provide non-secure feedback to the case manager or counselor as needed. We are now going to review the in-person human reader accommodation, which is an oral presentation of test content to an eligible student in a separate setting. So, how does human reader work on WIDA Access, where nearly all text is already read aloud by a recorded human voice? Some of the text is not read aloud, like the incidental text you see on the screen in the image. Some of that text can be read to students with a disability that requires all allowable on-screen text to be read. This accommodation is called In-Person Human Reader. In this training, you will learn what you are allowed to do and how to respond to student requests for help, how to read punctuation and emphasis, how to read with appropriate neutral style, what you can and cannot read, and rules for repeating. In-Person Human Reader, also known as IR or Read Aloud, is a support for students who cannot sufficiently demonstrate their content knowledge without the text being read aloud, including incidental text. The support can include focusing attention in addition to print reading. Students who need human readers for the entire assessment, rather than as a supplement to the recording, take the paper-pencil WIDA test. For example, students who require lip reading. IEP and 504 teams carefully select accommodations. Students with Read Aloud coded have Read Aloud listed in their IEP and 504 plans. If you have concerns about the appropriateness of the accommodation, contact your principal or call Kiana Hennigan in assessment at 4057. Readers must be familiar with and to the student, provide Read Aloud support during instruction and assessments, preferably to this specific student, be familiar with the student's IEP or 504 plan and know how to use other supports the student requires. Be Read Aloud trained and familiar with the terminology and symbols specific to the test content and related conventions, and be proctor trained with extensive practice and administration of assessments in accordance with district and state rules and guidelines. Review the manual and training before you test and bring them both with you. They are handy to reference, and you will want to remind your student about how you are there to be the reader and what the rules are for reading. You will be reading in a separate setting, though one-on-one is preferred, so you don't disturb other students and protect the confidentiality of the test. While you read, you will avoid coloring your tone and gesturing. You aren't storytelling, you are trying to read neutrally without leading the student with your face, tone, or posture to understand your speech. During testing, you can comply with student requests that don't compromise the test content. You can adjust your speed or volume as requested. You can pause your reading to allow the use of it or aid in technical support of the features that the student wants to use, like a magnifier or highlighter. You may also answer procedural questions like locating the pause button, or if the student is allowed to answer a dictionary, which they are not. Repeating what you read aloud as a human reader is not permitted, so make sure that your space is quiet and your student is attending to you before you start reading. Attending means that they are looking at you or the computer, nodding, or otherwise actively listening. Direct a distracted student back to you before reading. You may not repeat anything unless the student couldn't hear you over a loud noise or the student has an additional accommodation coded. Repeat in-person human reader lets you repeat whatever you are allowed to read, but there are rules. You repeat everything else as many times as your student asks, except listening items. Listening items can only be repeated one time. Make sure that the student is listening and/or looking when you repeat. Make sure you know ahead of time if the student has RP coded or not. Like you learned in your proctor training, you are not permitted to discuss, define, translate test content, or provide any feedback about whether the student is answering correctly. You may not prompt or influence the student to change their answer, nor can you indicate if they are correct. You may not read any portion of the test that you are not permitted to read or that is not part of your student's IEP or 504 plan. While you can help a student with technical concerns, they should be driving the computer for the most part unless you are their scribe. Like any proctor, you would not want to click their answers unless you were providing technical aid and were precisely instructed. The consequences for doing the above includes invalidation of the student test and reporting a violation of the Code of Conduct. Now it's time for a quick quiz to check your understanding of read aloud basics. You notice that the student just gave an incorrect answer that you know they should have gotten right. You have been their classroom reader and you know they were just being careless. What should you do? A. Say and do nothing. B. Tell the student that they should think about their lesson from earlier today. Or C. Tell the student to check their work before moving on. Sometimes it's hard when you see a student making a mistake and you know they know the answer. Do your best not to react and move ahead. Anything else would invalidate the assessment and violate your code of conduct. Your student asks what a word you read just means. What should you do? A. If the word is not directly related to the answer, define it. B. Point to an image of the word on screen. Or C. Reply, do your best work. I cannot help you with that. This is a test of English proficiency. It is an adaptive test and a lot of the words will be hard. We want to know what students don't know. Be friendly and positive and tell them to do their best and move on. 3. Your student asks you to read something. Under which situations would you read it? A. The student has the repeat in-person human reader accommodation and needs you to read the listening choices a third time. B. The student has a repeat in-person human reader accommodation and needs you to read the writing notes a third time. C. The student only has the human reader accommodation and needs a speaking chart read again. D. The student has a repeat in-person human reader accommodation and needs you to read the reading chart. Remembering the read aloud rules is hard. Keep the materials handy and follow the rules. Listening items may not be repeated more than once, regardless of any accommodation. Repeating is only for special cases like disruptive noise or an accommodation of RP. Reading cannot ever be read aloud. So, what can you read aloud? Human readers may read only the following: text or labels and graphics, listening answer choices, or any text that appears on screen in grade 4 through 12 writing tasks. You are not allowed to describe graphics, and human readers may not read aloud any portion of the reading domain. So what can you read on the listening answer choices? The computer will read the prompt and the question aloud, and you, as the in-person human reader, will run your finger down the choices, pointing to each as you say 3, 5, 6. What can I read in the reading test? You are not allowed to read any portion of the reading test. What can I read in the writing materials? Readers may read the entire writing section aloud by student request, including those read by the computer voice. Make sure to read everything the recorded voice doesn't. Examine the notes first to plan a logical way to read them. For example, since the English language is read from left to right, you may want to start with the image on the left-hand side and point to the text you are reading as you say Maya Angelou. Then move on to the next section. Point to the text you are reading and say Thurgood Marshall, he became, and then finish the rest of the text. Human readers only read the text and graphics. Never describe or explain an image. Listen to the computer reader and note if the text in the graphic is not read. If it's not, first review the item and plan how to read it, then start with the title if there is one. From there, pick a logical order and read the rest of the text. Do not describe or explain the image. Point and say student's favorite subject. Point and say math. Point and say English. Point and say science. Point and say number of students. Run finger up the y-axis and say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do not describe or explain the image. Look at the image and the options on the screen and think about which is the right way to read this. Neither option is allowed, as this is for the reading domain. What is the right way to read the image on the left? Number 1, run your finger up the y-axis and say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You will not point and say onion, broccoli, radish, or pepper because you do not describe images. When it comes to punctuation, read the text as it's punctuated, similarly to how you would when you are reading English. When there is a period, you pause. When there are question marks, you raise your intonation. The interesting ones with this test is that when there are ellipses, they are used to signify missing text, so you'll pause briefly and read as ... When there are quotations, you will say quote and end quote at the beginning and end of quoted material. For example, Wilbur loves to go to ... He is learning dog math. What is dog math? Wilbur says, quote, 2 half cookies is only 1 cookie, end quote. Notice I did not do anything different when reading over the commas or the hyphens, as those are not the punctuations that are described in this training. Do not emphasize words that are not emphasized in print, but you also do not emphasize bolded, italicized, underlined, or all capital words. Instead, tell the student how the words are printed. Wilbur hates in bold baths. This chart is meant for future reference so you can know what you can read and the number of times you are allowed to repeat it. Please note that for the reading domain, nothing can be read and there are no repeats available. Prior to the test, prepare your read aloud accommodation by completing the training requirements, which are the proctor training and reviewing the Accessibility and Accommodations Manual. You will also review the IEP and 504 plan or assigned supports and make sure you understand the technology and supports your student will use. Meet with the student to do the practice test so you can explain how WIDA Read Aloud works. Consider adapting your read aloud protocols in the classroom to the state testing expectations to ensure consistency for your student. Preparing to read aloud on the day of testing, you will review the WIDA Accessibility and Accommodations Manual and have it on hand. Go back over how reading aloud works with your student in brief. Follow the protocols outlined in the manual and this training during administration, and contact your school coordinator if you feel that you may have made an error. After the test, collect up any secure items and return them to the school coordinator. This includes your rosters, test tickets, and scratch paper. Talk to the case manager or counselor if you had concerns about how reading went, like if the student told you not to read, but do not disclose any test content, including student responses, to anyone unless you have a safety concern for the student. Breaching test security has serious consequences for you and your student. Now we will review the Scribe accommodation, as a scribe is a specially trained proctor who writes student dictation down verbatim. Scribes must be familiar with and to the student, provide scribing support during instruction and assessments, preferably to this specific student, be familiar with the student's IEP or 504 plan and know how to use the other supports and devices the student requires, be scribe trained and familiar with the terminology and symbols specific to the test content and related conventions, review and understand scribing manuals and protocols, and be fully proctor trained and have extensive practice in administration of assessments in accordance with district and state rules and guidelines. Best practices for scribing. Scribe in a separate one-to-one setting. Students can dictate outline, plans, or drafts on scratch paper or on screen and should not be prevented access to planning and processing. Enter student responses verbatim directly into the test interface, but do not include vocalizations like or ah. Comply with student requests regarding use of all applicable features, tools, supports, and accommodations within the test environment. Ask the student to repeat words or parts as needed to accurately scribe. Do not ask in a way that suggests that the student should make a change or correction. Allow students to review and edit what was written. You may read the response back if requested. Respond to procedural questions asked by the student and provide appropriate technical assistance, such as test directions, navigation within the test environment, etc., but do not answer content questions, confirm answers, or anything similar to that matter. Do not compromise the integrity of student responses. Students may not be prompted, reminded, or otherwise assisted in formulating their responses during or after the dictation to the scribe. Do not question or correct student choices, alert students to errors or mistakes, prompt or influence students in any way. Do not edit or alter student work in any way. Scribes must record exactly what the student has dictated. Do not respond to student questions about test items if the response compromises validity of the test. Do not respond to test content questions or read the test items aloud. Scribing multiple choice. The listening, reading, and speaking tests contain only multiple choice answer types. Students must indicate their selection clearly, verbally, by pointing, assistive device, gesture, or another agreed upon and practiced method. Scribes must comply with student directions regarding screen and test navigation and use of the features available. Cue the student to review and confirm the selected answer and tell you that they are ready to move on. Type student responses verbatim into the test interface as spoken or indicated through assistive technology or other communication method used by the student. Correctly spell and punctuate using standard English writing conventions. Students are not required to edit. Students may request that the scribed writing be read back to them and make edits. Make all student requested changes, even if it is incorrect, and have the student confirm the correctness of the response. The best practice is to ask, "Are you finished?" or "Is there anything you want to add or delete?" Do not coach or attempt to influence the student. Ask every time or not at all. Do not move on until the student indicates they are ready. Prior to the test, you need to prepare to scribe by completing the training requirements, which includes the proctor training and following the WIDA scribing guidelines. Review the IEPs or 504 plans and make sure you understand the technology and supports your student will use. Review how you will scribe and practice with the student on the practice items. Few situations warrant emergency scribing. For example, students who become injured may use a scribe. Principals must file an incident report to request scribe access. Do not let the student test without a scribe, but do not scribe unless scribe access has been approved. Only experienced scribes should act as an emergency scribe. Emergency scribes are required to meet with the student before the test is provided to talk about how scribing works and complete practice. Preparing to scribe for the day of testing. Review the WIDA Accessibility and Accommodations Manual and have it on hand. Pay special attention to the differences between subject tests. Go back over how scribing works in brief to ensure that the student understands how scribing will work. Follow the guidelines from the manual in this training during administration, and contact your school coordinator if you feel that you may have made an error during scribing. After testing, collect any secure items and return them to the school coordinator. Test booklets, secure scripts, test tickets and rosters, and scratch paper. Talk to the case manager or counselor if you had concerns about how scribing went, like if the student told you not to scribe. But do not disclose any test content, including student responses, to anyone unless you have a safety concern for the student. Breaching test security has serious consequences for you and your student. That was a lot of information. There are some resources if you want to learn more about these accommodations. If you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to Kiana Hennigan, the assessment coordinator, at 4057, Beth DeGrace, the director of special services, or Nicole East, the multilingual learner coordinator. Thank you and happy testing!